Karoline Leavitt's performance on Fox News that night would be remembered as one of the worst moments of her political career. But it didn't look that way at the beginning. As an experienced media figure, she thought she could easily handle a rookie representative like Jasmine Crockett. She even thought she had gained the upper hand in the first question and answer round. But when Crockett's second question came, the confidence on Leavitt's face turned to panic. And from that moment on, the live broadcast became a nightmare for Leavitt. The Fox News studios in Manhattan hummed with their usual evening energy, but tonight felt different. The 8 p.m. slot for America Tonight had been promoting this showdown for days. Rising stars clash, progressive firebrand versus conservative voice. In the green room, Karoline Leavitt adjusted her navy blazer one final time and checked her notes. At 26, she had already served as White House press secretary under Trump, weathered countless hostile press briefings, and built a reputation as one of the most articulate conservative voices of her generation. Tonight's opponent was Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative from Texas who had been making waves with her prosecutorial questioning style in Congress. Leavitt smiled to herself. This would be easy. 3 minutes to air, called a production assistant. Across the hall, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly reviewing her own materials. No notes, no talking points, just a thick folder of documents that she had spent the weekend organizing. As a former prosecutor, she knew that preparation was everything, and tonight she had come prepared for war. The topic was supposed to be immigration policy, but both women knew this was really about something bigger: the future of American politics, generational change, and two very different visions of what leadership looked like. At 8 p.m. sharp, host Tucker Matthews introduced his guests with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that Fox News had perfected over the years. Tonight, we have two of the most talked about women in politics, Matthews announced, his voice carrying the gravity of someone introducing gladiators. Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary and rising conservative star, and Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, the progressive prosecutor turned politician who's been shaking up Washington. The camera cut to a split screen showing both women. Leavitt looked polished and confident, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression conveying the kind of controlled intensity that had made her famous. Crockett appeared calm and focused, her natural hair styled professionally, her posture suggesting someone ready for a serious conversation. "Ladies, thank you for joining us," Matthews continued. "Let's dive right in. The Biden administration's immigration policies have created what many are calling a crisis at the southern border. Ms. Leavitt, as someone who was in the White House, what's your assessment?" Leavitt leaned forward slightly, her media training evident in every gesture. "Tucker, what we're seeing is the predictable result of failed liberal policies. The Biden administration has essentially opened our borders, created incentives for illegal immigration, and put American communities at risk." She gestured confidently toward the camera. "When President Trump was in office, we had border security. We had policies that worked. We put America first. Now we have chaos because Democrats like Representative Crockett care more about their radical agenda than they do about American families." It was a strong opening, polished, on message, and designed to put Crockett on the defensive from the start. Matthews turned to Crockett. "Representative Crockett, how do you respond to those charges?" Crockett's response was measured, her prosecutor's training evident in her deliberate pace. "Well, Tucker, I think Ms. Leavitt is working from an interesting definition of chaos. But before we discuss policy, I'd like to establish some facts." She opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Ms. Leavitt, since you referenced your time in the White House, I'm curious about something. During your tenure as press secretary, how many times did you brief the media on immigration statistics?" Leavitt looked slightly confused by the question, but maintained her composure. "Representative, I briefed the media on all administration priorities, including border security, on a regular basis." "I'm sure you did," Crockett replied with a slight smile. "But I'm asking specifically about immigration statistics, numbers, data. How many times did you present actual statistics to the press corps? Leavitt's confidence flickered for just a moment. Representative, I presented information as directed by the administration. That's not what I asked. Crockett interrupted gently. I asked about statistics, data, numbers. Because I've reviewed the transcripts of your press briefings and I found something interesting. Crockett pulled out another document. In your 18 months as press secretary, you mentioned immigration in 47 different briefings, but in only 3 of those briefings did you cite specific, verifiable statistics. The rest were talking points, anecdotes, or general statements. Leavitt's polished demeanor was beginning to crack. Representative, I think you're missing the point. Actually, I think I'm getting to the point, Crockett said, her voice remaining calm but growing more focused. Because when you just accused the Biden administration of creating chaos, you didn't cite a single statistic. You didn't mention border crossing numbers, asylum processing times, or detention facility capacities. You gave us talking points. Matthews tried to intervene. Representative Crockett, let's let Ms. Leavitt respond. I'd love to hear her response, Crockett said, looking directly at Leavitt. Specifically, I'd love to hear her explain why border crossings actually decreased by 12% in the first 6 months of the Biden administration compared to the same period in the final year of the Trump administration. The statement hit like a thunderbolt. Leavitt's face went pale, and for the first time in the interview, she looked genuinely rattled. That's not accurate, Leavitt stammered. The Biden administration has overseen record levels of illegal immigration. According to what data? Crockett pressed. Because I'm looking at Customs and Border Protection statistics, and they tell a different story. Would you like to see them? Crockett held up another document, but didn't give Leavitt time to respond. Here's what the actual numbers show. Border encounters in Biden's first 6 months were 1.47 million. In Trump's final 6 months, they were 1.66 million. That's a 12% decrease. Leavitt looked like she'd been slapped. Her media training had prepared her for hostile questions, but not for this kind of detailed, fact-based dismantling. Representative, you're cherry-picking statistics, Leavitt said weakly. You're not looking at the full picture. I'm looking at official government data, Crockett replied. The same data that was available to you when you were press secretary. The same data you chose not to share with the American people. The interview was only 10 minutes in, but the dynamic had completely shifted. Leavitt, who had entered confident and in control, now looked defensive and unprepared. Matthews sensed his guest was in trouble and tried to throw her a lifeline. Ms. Leavitt, what about the broader issues of border security and immigration policy? Leavitt seized the opportunity to pivot. Tucker, that's exactly the point. The Biden administration has abandoned policies that worked. They've ended successful programs like Remain in Mexico. They've weakened ICE enforcement, and they've sent a message to the world that our borders are open. It was a more confident response, and for a moment, it seemed like Leavitt might regain her footing. But Crockett wasn't finished. Ms. Leavitt, since you mentioned the Remain in Mexico policy, I have another question for you. Crockett's tone remained conversational, but there was something in her voice that suggested danger ahead. During your time as press secretary, you defended that policy repeatedly. You called it humane and effective. Do you still believe that? Leavitt nodded firmly. Absolutely. It was a successful policy that ensured people waited for their asylum hearings in Mexico rather than being released into the United States. Interesting, Crockett said, pulling out yet another document. Because I have here a State Department report from your own administration that tells a different story. Leavitt's face went white. She clearly had no idea what document Crockett was referring to. This is a classified report that was declassified last month, Crockett continued. It details the conditions faced by asylum seekers under the Remain in Mexico policy. Would you like me to read some excerpts? Representative, I'm not familiar with that specific report, Leavitt began. Of course you're not, Crockett said, her prosecutorial instincts now fully engaged. Because you never asked to see it. You defended a policy without knowing its actual impact on human beings. Crockett opened the document. Quote, asylum seekers subjected to MPP, that's Migrant Protection Protocols, the official name for remain in Mexico, face significant risks including kidnapping, sexual assault, and extortion while waiting for their court dates in Mexican border cities. Leavitt looked like she wanted to disappear. Representative, every policy has trade-offs. Quote, children as young as 6 months old have been returned to Mexico under MPP, despite clear evidence that border cities lack adequate shelter and medical facilities for vulnerable populations. Crockett continued reading. The studio was dead silent except for the sound of Crockett's voice. Quote, Department of Homeland Security Internal Communications acknowledge that MPP has resulted in asylum seekers being placed in situations that violate international humanitarian standards. Crockett looked up from the document. Ms. Leavitt, you called this policy humane. How do you reconcile that description with your own administration's findings? Leavitt was visibly sweating now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to show signs of stress. Representative, I based my statements on the information I was given at the time. You based your statements on talking points, Crockett said firmly. You didn't ask questions. You didn't seek out additional information. You didn't do your homework. And as a result, you stood at that podium day after day defending policies that your own government knew were causing harm to children. The attack was devastating, not because it was loud or emotional, but because it was methodical and fact-based. Crockett had systematically dismantled not just Leavitt's arguments, but her credibility. Matthews tried desperately to help his struggling guest. Ms. Leavitt, how do you respond to these accusations? But Leavitt was clearly rattled. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by the deer-in-headlights look of someone who had walked into an ambush. Tucker, I think what we're seeing here is exactly the problem with Washington, Leavitt said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. Representative Crockett is playing gotcha games with classified documents and trying to score political points instead of having a serious policy discussion. It was a weak response, and everyone in the studio knew it. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Ms. Leavitt, this isn't a game. These are the lives of real people, families, children. And when you stand at a podium representing the United States government, you have a responsibility to know what you're talking about. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. You've spent this entire interview making claims without citing sources, defending policies without knowing their consequences, and attacking an administration whose actual record you haven't bothered to research. Crockett gestured to her folder. I came here tonight with facts, data, and documents because I believe the American people deserve better than talking points and political theater. They deserve leaders who do their homework. Leavitt looked like she was drowning. Representative, you're trying to relitigate the past instead of focusing on current challenges. I'm trying to establish that you don't know what you're talking about, Crockett said bluntly. Because if you did, you wouldn't have made the claims you made in your opening statement. The interview was becoming a public execution, broadcast live to millions of viewers. Matthews made one last attempt to save his guest. Let's talk about solutions. Ms. Leavitt, what would you propose to address current immigration challenges? Leavitt straightened up, clearly grateful for the chance to pivot to safer ground. Tucker, we need to return to the policies that worked. We need to secure the border. We need to enforce our laws. And we need to stop incentivizing illegal immigration. It was a generic response, the kind of safe talking point that had served her well in the past. But Crockett wasn't going to let her off that easily. Ms. Leavitt, you keep saying policies that worked, but you haven't demonstrated that you understand what those policies actually did. You've been exposed as someone who defends policies without researching their impact. So why should anyone trust your recommendations for future policy? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Leavitt's response was barely audible. I think we can agree that border security is important to all Americans. Border security is important, Crockett agreed. That's why it should be discussed by people who have actually studied the issue, not by people who rely on talking points and political slogans. Matthews looked at his notes desperately, trying to find a way to salvage the remaining 10 minutes of the show. Representative Crockett, what's your vision for immigration reform? Crockett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more constructive but no less authoritative. Tucker, immigration is a complex issue that requires evidence-based solutions. We need comprehensive reform that addresses border security, yes, but also creates pathways for legal immigration, addresses the root causes of migration, and upholds our humanitarian obligations. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had clearly spent time studying the issue in depth. We need to expand legal immigration channels so people don't feel compelled to cross illegally. We need to modernize our asylum system so cases are processed quickly and fairly. We need to invest in technology and personnel for border security. And we need to work with our international partners to address economic and security conditions that drive migration. It was a thoughtful, detailed response that stood in stark contrast to Leavitt's empty rhetoric. But most importantly, Crockett continued, we need leaders who are willing to engage with facts instead of hiding behind talking points. Leaders who ask hard questions and demand real answers. Leaders who understand that immigration policy affects real human beings, not just poll numbers. The implicit contrast with Leavitt was unmistakable. Matthews turned back to Leavitt for a final response, but she looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Ms. Leavitt, final thoughts? Leavitt tried to summon her earlier confidence but fell short. Tucker, I think tonight's discussion shows the difference between conservative solutions and liberal rhetoric. Americans want security, not speeches. It was a feeble attempt to turn the tables, but after being systematically dismantled for the previous 20 minutes, it came across as desperate, rather than defiant. Crockett smiled slightly. I agree that Americans want security, Ms. Leavitt. They also want leaders who know what they're talking about. Tonight I think we've demonstrated the difference. As the show went to commercial break, the contrast between the two women was stark. Crockett sat calmly, organizing her papers with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Leavitt looked shell-shocked, staring at the desk as if trying to figure out what had just happened to her. In the control room, producers were already fielding calls from other networks wanting to book Crockett for follow-up interviews. The performance had been masterful, not because she had been loud or combative, but because she had been prepared. Social media exploded almost immediately. Clips of Crockett's fact-based dismantling of Leavitt went viral within minutes. Conservative commentators struggled to defend Leavitt's performance, while progressive voices hailed Crockett as the future of Democratic leadership. But perhaps the most telling response came from an unexpected source. A former Trump administration official who tweeted, "As much as I disagree with Representative Crockett's politics, that was a masterclass in preparation and execution. This is what happens when you come to a fact fight with talking points." 3 days later, Leavitt quietly canceled her upcoming media appearances and took what her team called a strategic pause from television interviews. Crockett, meanwhile, saw her approval ratings soar and received invitations to speak at policy conferences across the country. The interview became a case study in political communications programs, not for its drama, but for its demonstration of how preparation and facts could devastate even the most polished political performer. Because in the end, politics isn't really about who talks the loudest or who looks the best on camera. It's about who does their homework, who understands the issues, and who respects the intelligence of the American people enough to come armed with facts instead of fiction. Jasmine Crockett had reminded everyone watching that night that in politics, as in law, there's no substitute for preparation. And Karoline Leavitt had learned the hard way that confidence without competence is a dangerous combination. The interview ended Leavitt's reputation as a rising star and established Crockett as someone who couldn't be taken lightly. But more importantly, it demonstrated something that had been forgotten in an era of political theater: the power of actually knowing what you're talking about. If this story inspired you, If it reminded you that facts matter more than talking points and preparation beats performance every time, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who prove that the best political weapon isn't anger or outrage, it's doing your homework. Because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to an opponent isn't to attack their character. Sometimes it's simply to expose the fact that they don't know what they're talking about.